Good morning, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Stephen Ruckman, Deputy Director of the S. War Institute. For those of you who don't know us, we are an academic center and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. We're really happy to be hosting today's discussion organized by Beatrice Ray, a visiting fellow with us this year at S. And she's invited two guests, Carlos Pereira and Zach Courser, to explore the role that pork barrel politics play in democracy, particularly whether earmarks and budgetary amendments are necessarily bad for the democratic process, or whether, when used transparently, they may actually strengthen the links between elected officials and the people they represent. Our panelists will take a comparative approach to this topic, looking specifically at how the question plays out in Brazil and in the United States. Carlos Pereira is a professor at the Brazilian School of Public and Business Administration at Fundação Getulio Vargas. His research focuses on comparative executive legislative relations, political economy, and public policy. Zach Courser is a visiting assistant professor of government at Claremont McKenna College and director of CMC's Policy Lab. His research agenda focuses on public policy, political parties, democracy, and populism. Beatrice Ray will be moderating the discussion. In addition to her SNF Agora Fellowship, she is a senior researcher at the Center for Studies on the Brazilian Congress at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, focusing on legislative politics from a comparative perspective. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. The conversation will last about 90 minutes. We'll have presentations from each of our speakers, and then Beatrice will offer her commentary and moderate a discussion among the panelists. During that portion of the discussion, you can feel free to keep your camera on or off, but just please make sure your audio is muted so we don't accidentally hear background noise. And when it's time for questions, we will be using the raise hand feature on Zoom and inviting participants to unmute and pose their questions in turn. On that, just a note about this room that you're seeing. We are in a conference room where we can only see the squares that have cameras on. So our panelists won't know that you've raised your hand unless your video is on. We will doing our part to make sure we can check the room to make sure we call on everybody who wants to speak, but just a note about that. So with that, without further ado, Beatrice, I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to thank everybody who is joining here in person and on Zoom. And I want to thank both Carlos and Zachary for agreeing to be here today to share their expertise on this topic that all the three of us are very passionate about, which is budgetary amendments in Brazil or earmarks in the US. So I'll turn it to Carlos to start his presentation.
Thanks, Beatrice, and such a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And what I'm going to share with you is part of a research agenda developed with two co-authors, Lúcio Reno and Frederico Bertolini from the University of Brasilia in Brazil. And let me share you the screen. Great. Okay. So I will start with this common knowledge of how negative pork barrel politics is understood by the literature and by political analysts in general. And however, as I will show to you today, and many municipalities in Brazil may extract several benefits out of this policy that everybody, or at least the majority of people, considers as a bad politics. And okay, so there is this debate, right, between universal impact versus local policy. So some people care more about policy that would generate impact to everyone versus to local politics. And the great majority of initiatives from legislatures in Brazil, they focus their initiatives to generate benefits where they get more votes, right? They need to feed a local network of, mayors, local council, and local contractors. So as much as resources a legislator is able to allocate in one particular local area, that local network will get more motivated and engaged in the re-election of these representatives. So that's the idea. So I will initiate with this former senator of the US Senate, Robert Byrne, who was considered the prince of pork at once. And I got a quote from him, so pork to the critic is service to people who enjoy some of the good things in life. And I have been happy to bring to West Virginia the project to which they refer. I have no apology for it. So I think that he passed away, right? He's no longer alive, but he was so many times re-elected as a consequence of those local services, right? And so, as I mentioned to you, the literature, the great majority of the literature has negative views about local policy. So, and Byrne, for instance, and the seminal work identified lots of inefficiency of particularizing benefits and collectivizing costs. And also Shepson and Berwangas, they claim that pork is economically inefficient, but they can be very popular. Also, Ortega and Penfold, and also Brusco and his co-authors, they have a very negative to pork barrel politics, saying that it generates patronage and conservative and reward for conservative parties, and also vote buy-in in Argentina. Also, Robinson and Verdier has an understanding that pork barrel politics would be equivalent to clientelism, and also it generates vote buy-in and low political competition, according to Dias Caeiros, and also Ernesto Calvo and Vic Murillo and claim that pork barrel politics generates clientelistic network that shape distribution of resources. Despite of those criticisms, right, and my own research and others have identified that pork barrel lubricates the coalition building in multi-party presidential settings, and in the case of Brazil is crucial because it helps a elected minority president to build and sustain majority in Congress. Also, it helps and the re-election success of incumbent legislators, and there is very strong and evidence showing that legislators that are more effective delivering pork increase their chance of re-election. Also, pork helps for legislators to keep pursuing the legislative career, not to change the career, not to change career path. So as soon as you get elected for the National Congress, you keep there. Also, and there is a work that I co-authored with Barry Ames and also Lucy Randall, in which we identify that there is no lack of representation by delivering pork, because we interview a sample of Brazilian voters at the local municipalities, and the most important results suggested that voters prefer that legislators spend more time allocating pork than allocating time and energy and providing national legislation. So if voters want pork and if legislators deliver pork, so there is no lack of representation. All right. So, but the point that I bring to you today is to what extent voters, citizens that live in those municipalities, if they can extract benefits out of this game. So we know that the executive gets returned, legislators get returned, but how about voters? So that's the main question, right? So the idea is the following: if voters at the local level, if they can extract benefits out of this game, so pork barrel also generates social inclusion, despite the fact that I'm going to show to you that inclusion is not sustainable over time. It dissipates lots of resources. So, and that inclusion is not efficient. But many people, they get benefits out of this game. So we have been able to get a very unique data set with more than 6,000 observations and data from 12 years and many indicators that measure social inequality and exclusion, economic performance, and political competition at the local level. We did a panel data analysis and selection bias to see the extent to which municipalities receive more support than others, and to see what are the determined political factors that help some municipalities to be extra benefited and others to be completely forgotten. Okay, and if to what extent those local benefits generate social and economic improvements. Okay, so here we have the map of Brazil and the distribution and of pork. So in the first map on your left-hand side, this green one, so the lighter the color, the higher and the amount of resources that municipality receives. So the darker and the color, the smaller the amount. So it's the light is above the mean and the darker below the mean. So it shows that there is a difference, an important difference. So some municipalities, they do receive more than others. Okay. Also, and this blue graph shows the percentage of years that a municipality received. So the darker is the larger the number of the greater the number of years, and the lighter and the greater the darker the smaller the number of years. You see also that we can see that there are some municipalities that receive more support consistently over time and others that receive less consistently. And finally, we did a LISA spatial cluster to see the extent to which and municipalities that are contiguous, that are close to one another, if they increase their probability or their chance of getting more and pork. And we see, for instance, that the darker blue is that the municipality that receive low, the contiguous municipality also receive lower. And the high, which is the dark red, and also shows that if you have a municipality next to the one, so there is a kind of attraction. So, and this is consistent with the idea that although legislators are able to get votes in their entire state, so the district magnitude in Brazil varies a lot from one state to the next, but legislators can cast votes in the entire state. But it's too expensive for legislators to do campaign in their entire state. The state of São Paulo, for instance, is huge. So, and strategically, legislators concentrate their campaign, their work, and their electoral connections in contiguous municipalities in order to dominate those municipalities and to create obstacles for competitors to enter in those municipalities. So that's exactly. Also, this is just the approved amendments in the budget, and here's what in fact appropriated. So there is a huge difference from what legislators demanded in the budget and what have been in fact executed, appropriated. Because as I mentioned to you earlier, Zach, and before 2015, and the executive used to have in total discretion on the budget appropriation of those amendments. It's no longer like that. And now, and those amendments, they are mandatory, but the data that we have is prior to those reforms, okay? All right, so let me give you some descriptive statistics and showing that around 56% received only one amendment, okay? 22% of the municipalities received at least 2 amendments in that period, and 9% received more than 3 amendments. So it shows that, and there are municipalities that receive more amendments than others, but that discrepancy is not that high, right? And okay, let me move on to show to this thing that it's a very interesting result here. And there is a potential and how can I say, imbalance between municipalities, because as you see, there is a statistically significant coefficient of those municipalities that received it in the previous year increase the probability of receiving it again. So there is a path dependency in that regard. So, and also, and if the mayor of that municipality belongs to the party of the president, it also increases the likelihood of receiving. So there is some political gain here. But the idea in this paper is to show the extent to which local people, citizens, local voters, they can extract benefits. We did a matching, a propensity score matching, trying to compare relatively similar municipalities based on many different observed characteristics, such as population, the size of the population, the size of the income distribution, the GDP growth, and the education, so on and so forth. So the idea here is that the only thing that differentiates one municipality to the next is receiving or not receiving port, right? Supposedly, we are comparing and municipalities that receive it and not receive. So the treatment here is receiving port, and the control group is not receiving port. So let's gonna go to the result. As you're gonna see, if a municipality that received port for at least 1 year compared to those municipalities that did not receive port, decrease in infant mortality in about 14%. And this is statistically significant. So this result is extremely important. So despite the fact of many people would have moral concern about this gain, people get benefits, you know, they can decrease, and they're you know, are very important. So if you have many kids dying, and because of that, which is good. However, if you guys observe it, so after the 5th year of receiving port is no longer statistically significant. It means that the municipality keep receiving the money, but it does not generate the benefits that initially was important. So which suggests that port does not provide a sustainable benefit over time. And this is also the case, for instance, of generating formal jobs. After 9 years, you know, receiving port does not generate more benefits. And let me give you, because this is just a dichotomous exercise that I did initially, receiving or not receiving. Here we have the proper amount in a continuous fashion. So as we see, we have a very positive response to the dose of pork, but the longer effect is declining for formal jobs, for health. You know, it increased the quality of health of the municipality, but the benefits no longer is statistically significant. So the benefit decreases at the margin, right? Also concerning education, there is a discrepancy between the age of the student and the grade that they are enrolled. So the more pork the municipality received, so that discrepancy also decreases. However, the long effect is declining, and the same result we got for this distortion of age and grade. and also infant mortality. So in order to conclude, we're going to say that legislative local policy generates social inclusion and economic improvements, no doubt about it. This serves as evidence of the fact that local policy initiatives made by Congress generate benefits and consequently have an impact over the reduction of inequality and economic improvements in Brazil. However, local policy also tends to generate dissipation of resources. So, because there are many municipalities that never receive it because legislators do not have connection. So they only get motivated to deliver pork if they expect to obtain electoral returns out of this policy. So there is no coordination among them. It's a completely free market, let me say, and a free market of pork. And this is the negative side of this game. But anyhow, my idea here was to bring evidence showing that and pork also provides not only benefits to politicians themselves, but also to people who live in those municipalities. Okay, that's it. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I will now turn to Zachary for his presentation on earmarks in the United States.
Thanks, Beatrice. Sharing screen. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Beatrice, and to the Agora Institute for inviting me here to talk about the evolution of earmarking in the U.S. Congress. I've got 40 slides for 20 minutes, so I'm going to do my best to get through this. I may kind of power through some analysis of current earmarks. If you have any questions, though, about things that I may not have covered fully, of course, please ask me a question as we move on. So Congress has had something of a turbulent history recently about earmarking. And I'll walk you through this evolution of congressional earmarking. Really before 2007, Congress, things changed from Congress to Congress, but largely there was an institutional role that earmarks played in the appropriations process. That changed on the margins, but really from the first Congress remained the same idea. And I'll talk more about sort of pre-reform ideas of congressional earmarking. But starting in 2007, thanks to several scandals and having earmarking in the headlines, Congress, the Democrats, when they took over in 2007, inaugurated really the first period of reform of congressional earmarking. I'll talk about how successful that was and what that meant. In 2011, Congress and the executive came together to essentially put a moratorium on earmarking. It ended for 10 years. And it's only since 2021 that earmarking has come back to Congress. And so my presentation today will basically walk us through the pre-reform to the second reform period, talk about the roles that earmarking plays in congressional politics, and how it helps to shape the institution. So what is the constitutional basis of earmarking? Well, this is, to me, and I think to many proponents of earmarking, this is sort of a baseline understanding of Congress's power under Article 1, the sort of primacy that Congress has over the power of the purse. James Madison said in Federalist 58, speaking about Congress's Article 1 powers over spending, the power of the purse may, in fact, be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. The spending power that Congress holds in the Constitution is very essential to its power. Really, nothing can get done in the federal government unless Congress decides to spend on it. And as we talk about earmarking becomes not only a symbol of that power, but it becomes a tool both within the institution in terms of allowing members to fulfill their Article 1 responsibilities, but to linking the members to the institution, not to their parties, but rather to their jobs as representatives and sort of collectively as members of Congress. And then lastly, as a way to guard against encroachments of the executive not only in the appropriations process, but sort of overall in budgetary negotiations. So what is an earmark? So I find this definition, there's a longer definition that Congress has for itself, but I find this definition from the Congressional Research Service to be useful. It's any congressionally directed spending, tax benefit, or tariff benefit if it benefits a specific entity or state, locality, or congressional district other than through a statutory or administrative formula or competitive award process. Essentially what this means is it's a very sort of specific request on behalf of a member of Congress, whether they be in the House or the Senate, on behalf of a very specific purpose within their district or state. The reason the term earmark started is essentially it's folding the side of a piece of paper to basically note that there will be an appropriation, a special appropriation for a member of Congress. That's where the term derives it from. And it's not just for the federal legislature. There are some states that have systems. I know the most about New Mexico's process. They have, I've actually had a chance to talk to the governor of New Mexico about this process that basically comes from natural resource monies, but is very similar to the way in which Congress in the pre-reform era ran earmarking. So I have a list here of sort of the benefits of earmarking. I would say that some of these I think are sort of received wisdom. That is to say, what Congress people and people inside the Beltway thought the benefits of earmarking were. So they're perceptions rather than sort of empirical realities. And some of them are actually been sort of tested and understood. And as we work through the presentation, I'll give you a sense of sort of, which are sort of opinions and which are more objective. But to give you an idea of sort of how Congress and people outside of Congress saw earmarking before the pre-reform era and really today, one is, as I was saying, earmarking helps to institutionalize Congress's Article I spending powers. No one knows the needs of a district or a state better at the federal level than a member of Congress or a senator. And the idea is that Congress, in order to understand and bring resources, needed resources to their districts or states, that they should have some ability to appropriate specially for those. And also, again, this sort of problem of linking members of Congress not simply to their parties, but to their districts and to the institution itself. And as I'll talk about later in the presentation, earmarking really did have a positive impact in terms of lowering polarization and increasing a kind of comity in the appropriations process. I've already sort of said this empowers individual legislators, but this, I think today, this is especially important, particularly in the House of Representatives, where it's very uncommon for bills to be opened up to amendment. It's, if you're a freshman congressperson, even if you have some seniority, it's unless you have some connection to the leadership or some profound reason that they need your support, it's really unlikely that your bills are going to be opened up to amendment. And so this is actually a way in which you can involve individual members of Congress in a way that they couldn't involve themselves through the normal, what has become really the sort of normal process of legislating. A perception within Congress has been that earmarking helps re-election, particularly for vulnerable members, that leaders on both sides, in the majority and the minority, when they're thinking about distributing earmarks, at least in the pre-reform era, they were very aware of vulnerable members and they tried to accommodate them with more earmarks. In the pre-reform era, earmarks were also a leadership tool for whipping votes for their legislative priorities. This didn't happen every day. It wasn't necessarily a commonplace occurrence, but when the leadership had close votes on their priorities, it was not uncommon for them to reach out to individual members who might be on the border of voting and asking them, would you vote in favor of our legislation if we manage to get an earmark for you? And then lastly, it helped build consensus for the budget, thereby reducing polarization around the budget process. If you go back to the 90s and into the 2000s, you find that budget bills used to pass with overwhelming majorities. Everyone was sort of getting what they needed. But as this process became more ideological, and then certainly when the moratorium started and earmarking ended, this sort of grease of building consensus through earmarks made passing budgets much more ideological, much less transactional, and much more difficult. So I got to give equal time. Obviously I seem to be kind of a fan of earmarking. But there have been criticisms of earmarking from the beginning of Congress. And we'll talk about these. Some have more truths than others. Probably the number one, perception of earmarking was that earmarking is wasteful, that these are unnecessary or unneeded benefits for specific projects that have no national purpose, but even within the district seem to be wasteful. You can see in this congressional pig book, which is something that Citizens Against Government Waste have put out for years and years and continue to do so. They will highlight projects like, the National Train Museum or the National Teapot Museum, or these sort of like small particularistic kinds of benefits for a district that may seem very valuable within the district, but without seem like a complete waste of money. Another criticism that's been levied often is that it raises the deficit. This is something that opponents to earmarking, and as the budget itself and deficit spending has become more ideological, with Republicans being more concerned than Democrats, the specter of raising deficits, gets attached to earmarking. A criticism of earmarking, certainly in the pre-reform era, was that it lacked transparency. It's absolutely true. I think it was a very fair criticism that it was really hard to track who was asking for what and who got what and why. And that another is that earmarks opened up appropriations to corruption and abuse, which had some truth to it, which I'll talk about. And then lastly, that earmarking favored seniority. If you were a senior member of Congress, if you were an appropriator, you were much more likely to get earmarks. The distribution of earmarks was unfair and tended to be biased towards appropriations and seniority. So in the pre-reform era of earmarking, this practice, again, goes back to the first Congress. This is something that is well understood within the history of the US Congress. And it was really, again, a sort of well-integrated part of the appropriations process. Again, often derided as wasteful pork barrel politics. But in truth, earmarks made a relatively small impact on discretionary spending, at least insofar as when we became able to better track what was an earmark and what wasn't, started again in 1994. It was about 5%. And as I'll talk about the budget process, it was never a deficit adder. It was always within the budget limits. And so the idea that this was a budget busting deficit spending kind of activity is simply untrue. And I think this is very true, the value of an earmark really depended on your perspective. If you're an individual member of Congress, if you're from that district, you tended to have a very different idea of, that bridge or that school or that children's hospital that was getting built versus, a sort of national blowback against wasteful spending or the perception that somehow spending that was happening in particular ways was somehow unfair. And I think that really comes down to a change that we've seen in American politics that we see reflected in Congress. In the 19th century and into the 20th century, I think people and congressional members were much more comfortable with what I would call a transactional form of politics. Literally, who gets what? An idea that politics was really about trying to distribute, the benefits that the federal government had in terms of resources. And it really was a kind of political process, a transaction of, I need this, what do you want in return? And politics ran like that, I think, very successfully in the 19th and into the 20th century. But as American politics has become much more ideological, that people are much more concerned and motivated by ideas and sort of, staying true to certain ideological precepts, the idea of transactional politics becomes anathema. It just seems corrupt at its base. Legislation should, distribute monies by formula that are undergirded by policy, which are undergirded by ideology. But the idea of sort of individuals receiving special benefits, that seems corrupt. And I think that's one of the big biases in the modern era against earmarks. But I will say that before the pre-reform era and really during the reform era, both parties participated in earmarking equally. They had different priorities. Earmarking did not look the same in terms of what they spent on, but they both eagerly participated. So I'm starting in 1994 because there was a CRS report, Congressional Research Service, that went through and analyzed earmarking starting in 1994 to try to get some grips on what did it look like, what were we spending and what were we spending it on. And honestly, and they admitted very much in the report, this is a very sort of woolly kind of estimate because it was hard to define what an earmark was in any particular fiscal year. And it was difficult to track these kinds of spending, but they did their best. And so I think this is actually a pretty good snapshot of the expansion of earmarking from 94 to 2005. And what you can see is, again, these are estimates. The percentage of discretionary spending in each of these years, I think probably was around 5%. Because I think appropriators had a very good grasp on how much they were going to spend on earmarking. I think they set that number, and I think that number was probably 5%. But what was interesting is, of course, total spending is going up overall in Congress, but they're trying to keep that 5%. But what's interesting is that by 2005, they're carving up that 5% into smaller and smaller and smaller increments. Earmarking becomes a much bigger part of the appropriations process, and it becomes much more important to individual members who are making more requests and receiving more requests by 2005. So the volume of earmarking and the practice of earmarking really does go up in the 10 years from 94 to 2005. Unfortunately, alongside this shift and increase in earmarking also comes a series of high-profile scandals in the 2000s that really shifted public perception toward thinking earmarking was corrupt. And I'll quickly move through these. Randy Duke Cunningham used his position as a defense appropriator essentially to distribute earmarks in return for bribes. You want an earmark on the defense appropriations bill, you got to pay me this much money. And he was convicted of this and sentenced to jail. Jack Abramov had a somewhat more distant relationship with earmarking, but because earmarks were so common, because he was essentially in the business of trying to link his clients with particular earmarks, when a scandal blew up that he was bribing members of Congress and engaged in all sorts of different nefarious activities that had to do with influence, this became yet another strike against earmarking. And then Ted Stevens' Bridge to Nowhere. Now, this one just hasn't gone away. I think even today, almost 15 years later, we still talk about the Bridge to Nowhere. So Ted Stevens was in the majority in the Senate. He was the head of the Appropriations Committee. And he had an earmark for $235 million for a bridge that would connect an island to the mainland in Alaska. And this became the sort of poster for the corruption of earmarking. Here we have a senior legislator wasting hundreds of millions of dollars on a stupid bridge to nowhere. All of this comes together to shift public opinion and Congress's perception against earmarking. And so in 2006, when Democrats retake the majority and start legislating in 2007, one of the first things they do is create a reform of earmarks. And so they add a lot more transparency to the process. I won't go through these specifically, but you got to say who it's for, you got to say what it's for, you got to say how much, and you have to say that you have no financial interest in it. And it was not posted in an easy to read form on the internet. It was included in conference reports or committee reports. These weren't terribly easy to track, but they were traceable. And it really did give the public and political scientists and different policymakers an opportunity to actually see what was happening inside the earmarking process. You can actually see from this period who got what, which you really couldn't in an easy way before. So once this reform process took hold, you can see that earmark spending was not a big part of the appropriations process. It was bigger in military construction and energy and water, but overall it accounted for 2.8% of discretionary spending during this period of reform. The idea that this was a budget busting discretionary spending problem is just simply untrue. I got to quickly run through this, running out of time, but to understand how earmarking was working during the reform process and before, I interviewed 10 former members of Congress, 5 from each party, talking to members who experienced all 3 forms of earmarking, the pre-reform, the reforms, and then the moratorium. And I interviewed a mix of different seniorities, people from different states, a mix of appropriators and non-appropriators, basically to try to understand how is it the process actually worked before 2011, before the moratorium. just quickly, I'll go through these. Members said that it wasn't deficit spending, which I think is clear. They believed that there was a bipartisan consensus approach to earmarking. That is to say, there may be a 60-40 split between majority and minority, but once that split happened, nobody micromanaged it. The minority decided who got what, the majority decided who got what, and it was really kind of an institutional appropriations kind of activity, not a party political activity. One comment that I heard from several members was that earmarks help to bring resources to rural areas and help to mitigate distributional effects in those areas. If you rely on a process that is fully within the administration and is more grant-like, where who gets what is defined by law, populated areas, urban areas tend to benefit and get the most resources in those kinds of situations. Rural areas less so, and members found that individual appropriations to the earmarking process were a real help in bringing resources to those kinds of areas. In fact, one member called it first aid money for real America, which is a very sort of political statement, but I think it sort of captures the idea. So how did it work? So you see the results of the survey from the different members here to the right, but I'll just quickly summarize. Leadership sparingly used them as a tool for obtaining votes for critical passage of priorities. Once in a blue moon, maybe. Members were very reticent to say they would take money for this, but they saw others that did. Both parties participated equally. Republicans, as deficit spending became more controversial for them, they still participated. And both parties allocated earmarks for the minority in what was perceived as a fair manner. There wasn't a sort of change in that distribution. There was a bias towards the Appropriations Committee. There was a bias towards seniority. Being in leadership was an advantage, and being competitive, having a competitive reelection was an advantage. So members didn't feel, unless you're an appropriator, members didn't feel that these were distributed very fairly, that there was a real bias in a number of ways. Asking members how the reform period worked, reforms were well received by House members. They all thought that the reform era actually fixed a lot of problems with earmarking. But the thing it didn't fix is the negative perception of earmarking. They knew it at the time, and earmarking became sort of an easy scapegoat in 2011 when a budget crisis hit and deficit spending zoomed to the top of the federal agenda. And what you had is a strange confluence between both parties and both chambers of Congress and the executive and Congress. They all came together against earmarking. And essentially, the way this was inaugurated was a speech by President Obama during the 2011 State of the Union, where he threatened to veto any spending bill with earmarks. Now, on the surface, knowing about the fact that it has no deficit spending impacts, this seems a purely political gesture. But Congress went with it. They knew earmarks were a loser, and to win back the confidence of the American public, they agreed to put a, quote, moratorium on earmarking. Now, this wasn't in official rules of the House or the Senate. This is in party rules, not institutional rules, so it would be easy to change, but nonetheless, it was present, and it was adhered to by both parties and both chambers. And what sort of extraordinary about it is that Congress unanimously and voluntarily ceded a major role in their spending powers to the executive in doing so. And what you found is that earmarking didn't go away, it just sort of changed forms. After the earmark moratorium, Congress people actually had to go to the executive and ask for money. A thing called letter marking started happening, where members would actually write letters to executive departments and agencies, basically saying, I would like this special appropriation for my state or district. Can you please give it to me? And instead of being more transparent, it became less transparent, these letters and who got what. And there was also a bias towards whoever, the party of whomever held the presidency. There was a study done that showed that during the Obama administration and the Labor Department, Democrats did much better on receiving letter marking benefits than did Republicans. The effects of the moratorium on legislative capacity. I got to move through this quickly. There's a lot to say. But on the left here, this is an analysis of predictors of voting for House leadership priorities from 2007 to 2015. And comparing the pre-moratorium to post-moratorium period, voting yes on leadership priorities actually declined, which seemed to indicate that it became more difficult for the majority to get their priorities through in the absence of earmarking. And on the right here, I've added this sort of timeline, but this comes from a study by Francis Lee and a co-author about looking at legislative capacity. And I'm showing the earmarks reform era. And you can see there's an immediate consequence to the ability of leadership to get their legislative priorities through. Essentially, it goes to 0% of most of their legislative priorities getting through starting in the 112th Congress. Now, there's a lot of conflicting other kinds of causal explanations having to do with polarization and the Tea Party movement and lots of different reasons. But there's at least a lot to suggest that getting rid of earmarking certainly didn't make running Congress any easier. So, should the earmark moratorium end? Members of Congress thought absolutely it should. In fact, it was a 9-1 with the only one being don't know, like wasn't sure. But these members of Congress, Republicans, Democrats, this whole mix, they're like, absolutely bring it back. It was stupid to get rid of it. It was a political move. Bring it back with reforms. There's some suggestion of which reforms, but yes, bring it back. In 2019, the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress actually recommended a program that was very similar to earmarking. It was more of a grant-based program rather than one that was discretionary, but nonetheless, it basically helped to build a little groundwork because there was a bipartisan agreement between Republicans and Democrats on this committee that we ought to bring back some form of earmarking. And I think it helped to lay the groundwork for bringing back earmarks. And now I wrote, part of this report was, myself and my co-author, Kevin Courser at the American Enterprise Institute, us saying we absolutely should bring back earmarking with the following needs: be transparent, reduce potential for abuse, and increase equity in distribution. And lo and behold, of course, the causal mechanism here is we put the report out in February. By April, Congress said absolutely. So in April of 2021, the House Appropriations Committee put together a process for basically reintroducing a modified version of earmarking. They limited members to only 10 requests that they could make. They capped spending at 1% of discretionary spending. And appropriations subcommittees issued guidance on which accounts could be charged. Basically, what could we spend on earmarking was limited and decided by committees. A lot more transparency. Funded requests were available the same day committee markup. Members were required to post their request on the House website on their own House websites. An appropriation committee had to post all these as well. So a lot more transparency. Definitely reining in equity by limiting and making it equal the kinds of requests that you could make, and making sure that there would be no deficit spending. One interesting change, and this seems to come out of the Modernization Committee, is this idea of you had to provide evidence of community support. You couldn't just say, for purely subjective reasons, I want to fund this one, I want to fund that one. You had to give some evidence. Now, Beatrice, I want to ask you a little bit because I know you got some experience with this. What exactly the form that evidence took? Was it pro forma or was it meaningful in some way? Members had to certify that they, their spouse, or immediate family had no financial interest, so it widened in terms of guaranteeing no interest. This was really interesting too, a ban on direct funding for for-profit grantees, getting for-profits out of the earmarking process, and thereby hopefully reducing the temptations for corruption and abuse through lobbying and other sorts of special interests. And then requiring the Government Accounting Office to audit a sample of enacted projects and report its findings to Congress. This seems like a kind of a weak link here. I don't think we'll have time to talk about it, but at least it's a good idea at least. Moving ahead quickly, I know I'm over time here. Senate passed essentially a similar role, or rather a similar form of reformed earmarks. They did not limit the number of requests, however, but they did set a cap at 1% of discretionary spending, as the House had done. And otherwise, similar reforms to the House. But the one that's really important, and you can see it in sort of the outcomes, was they weren't as focused on equity. And so you see in the Senate that the process really was inequitable in terms of its outcomes. I'll roll through these really quickly to look, this is an analysis of 2020 in terms of numbers of requests and participation. I'll say generally that one big surprise, I think, in the House was the GOP caucus in the House accepted earmarking. They didn't push against it. It was a real surprise for me, and I think it was a surprise for a lot of people that the ideological cant against deficit politics would lead Republicans to say, no way. But actually, the House went in for it, and participation was relatively high at almost 60%. in terms of requests in 2022. So while Democrats were all in, there's only one, Katie Porter, that decided not to make a request. Republicans, for the most part, not only allowed it, but actually participated in it. And in terms of equity, if you look at per capita, there's still some bias, but it's much more even than the Senate, and I'll show you that a little later. And in terms of appropriators were not overrepresented. 16 appropriators received 16% of earmarks, and everyone else received 84, which is actually a pretty reasonable and sensible split. In the Senate, the story much different. The Senate Republicans passed before the end of the moratorium a lifetime ban on earmarks in their party, a lifetime. The sun could wink out and no more earmarks. And they didn't want to revisit that. Basically what they did is they said, okay, everyone gets a pass. You could ignore that party rule. If you want an earmark, go ahead, even though it's against the rules, you can ask for an earmark. Well, this had a real chilling effect on who wanted to participate. Only about a third of GOP members of the Senate wanted to participate. And so there was a real lack of balance between requests and receipts in the Senate. As you can see, a huge bias towards appropriators in terms of who got what in the Senate. Appropriators got almost 60% of earmarks in the Senate. But despite these inequalities in the Senate, this is comparing that period of 2008 to 2010 to fiscal year 2022. Spending went down on earmarks. They held the line on the 1%, and it really changed the type of spending. Military and construction, which used to be a big part of pre-reform earmarking, is no longer a big part of it. In fact, in certain committees, you couldn't even charge those accounts. Really, where those monies are going now is transportation, which is probably where it belongs. So I'll end here. I've got more to say about the future of earmarking, but I'm out of time. Looking at the review of the second reform era of earmarking, the broad participation helped the process in the House. Spending was kept in check, and equity was increased. I think the abuse reforms are very promising, and there was good transparency, but it could use a lot of help, I think. On the Senate side, I think the lack of buy-in from the GOP really undermines broad participation. But they did keep equity in check, despite the fact that, spending in check, despite the fact that equity is a real problem, I think, in the Senate. There also transparency and abuse, I think, are in a good place in the Senate, but in terms of transparency, they could do more in the way in which they report out who gets what. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Zachary. I asked you to present after Carlos because I thought we would end on a positive note that it is possible to reform earmarks. We were talking about how in Brazil we're in the middle of a huge corruption scandal with what is called the secret budget, which is very similar to the corruption scandals that you were talking about. So it's good to see an example of, yes, it can be fixed. And we have evidence that suggests that it's an important mechanism in democratic systems. What we need to do is just think about how to make it more transparent and absolutely legal so that there are no questions about that. I do want to ask a question that relates to your question to me. I was EBSA congressional fellow and I worked for a representative in the House, and I was responsible for doing all the earmarks process after the reform. And I felt that there was a huge tension between the electoral needs of my representative and the socioeconomic needs of the district. And you asked me about evidence of community support. I think that varies a lot across offices. In my office, I think we could have done a much better job. So I think my question to both of you is just how to balance. Carlos, you showed evidence that that earmarks or budgetary grants can help voters, right? But there is a limit to that also. So how can we balance this tension between electoral needs and socioeconomic needs when we're thinking, especially in this process of reforming earmarks in the US, where I know we're ahead, in Brazil we're behind, we're going to get there. But how do we balance that? Because I think ideally, in my perspective, after working for the US Congress, I think you would need to respect both to a certain extent. But just do we, and how do we do it?
Oh my God, this is a very tough question, Beatriz. How we balance, because, as I mentioned earlier, the main motivation of politicians are re-election, right? So they would like to get re-elected. And the game is very competitive, right? Different than the US, the rate of re-election in Brazil, on average, with the exception of 2018 election, was 68%. So here in the US is above 90%. So legislators in the US, they are by far a much safer avenue for their jobs than in Brazil. So and earmarking in Brazil is key for their re-election. And if they give up the power of allocating according to their local interests, they're going to be, those earmarking politics will become useless to them. So how can we coordinate, how legislators can coordinate the allocation, taking into account people needs? So it's very difficult because you are suggesting some kind of regulation, and as if would have a kind of regulatory agency that would establish rules that municipalities, for instance, that received it in the previous year cannot receive it in the next, and so on and so forth. But if I cannot receive it in the next, and if I cannot allocate, resources to where I would receive recognition, voters recognition, local network interest recognition, why should I allocate that money? So it's really tough to think in a regulation that would balance, as you said. And so I don't know to address you.
Actually, I have a lot of thoughts on this question. I think it's a critical question about this whole process is. Now, I was talking about transactional politics earlier, and how we live in an era of very ideological politics, where people not only do people not recognize the kinds of transactional benefits of that kind of process, but they see it as corrupt. Mm-hmm. That if it's outside of a formula, if it's outside of some kind of extremely equitable process, ergo, it must be corrupt. And I think, part of that thinking helped to start the moratorium, and I'm really surprised earmarks came back, frankly, because what is forgotten in the trade-off between a sort of fully transparent, formula-only kinds of politics is the effect it has in the chamber itself and the legislative process. And so I'd say a couple of things. One is, I think that, in the second reform era, I think even before that, if we look at specific earmarks from 2008 to 2010, these were not wasteful spending kinds of initiatives. What you found they tended to be for were literally children's hospitals, or today it would be for equipping police with cameras, or these kinds of really needful transportation projects that the state couldn't manage for some reason, the federal government could come in and help with. So it's not nearly as wasteful as people think, is probably the first thing I would say. So if you actually look at what we're spending on, these are actually seem very meritorious kinds of projects that are needed in the particular district. But getting down to the question of, again, who gets what and why, and people get very concerned about what's the decision-making process. I feel very comfortable personally with having a process whereby politics plays a role, because politics has to play a role in appropriations and in legislative politics. If you allow something like earmarks, you take some pressure off of ideology, first off, by giving members an outlet to give back to their districts, to bring home the bacon without reference to a particular party or agenda. This really lowers the temperature in a number of different ways.
And this equitable way of allocating resources would not generate the bonus, right? So I should get something.
That's exactly right.
Reward. Exactly right. Being in the government, right? Supporting the government has a cost. So it's not costless activity,
yes,
right? Especially because all criticism that the government receives may affect my own career as a legislator. So in order to overcome the potential cost for supporting the government, I have to receive a bonus, otherwise I don't want to be in the government. So, right? So,
There's a cost,
so
transactional cost,
this idea of allocating the same amount of resources for everyone would generate distortion as well, because and I will no longer be motivated to do this kind of thing.
But maybe more in a multi-party setting than in a two-party setting. I don't know.
Well, a couple of things. One is I don't really know fully what the earmarking process pays for in Brazil. Like you were looking at things like infant mortality and sort of very big kind of social ideas that implies that there's actually like big benefits to health and education, sort of, you know, base kinds of services that
building a hospital or a health facility or a bridge.
And well, in the American context, you know, Social Security, Medicare, these kinds of benefits are not earmarks, right? The earmarks tend to be much more about transportation or a military base, you know, sometimes a children's hospital, sometimes having to do with police force, these kinds of things. But it's not a question of like the prosperity of one district versus another.
I see.
It's more sort of a little icing on the cake, right? Like we're all doing a little better here, and
Frost.
we're all doing a little better through this process. It doesn't cost too much, and it has tremendous benefits both for the district and for the functioning of the institution and for the electoral prospects of the member. And so whatever we lose, I think, in a sort of equitable distribution, we gain in a sort of political advantage in terms of a Congress that runs better and districts that receive benefits that are, you know, particular and localistic, but nonetheless needed. But it's not a question of like, you know, who's getting dinner tonight.
Well, I think the socioeconomic landscape of Brazil is very different from the US. I mean, the district I worked for, the community project fundings that we sent, there were a lot of hospitals, and I visited the hospitals. Like there were hospitals, they really needed the money for renovating. Not like a hospital in Brazil, for sure, that needs to be renovated. The situation in Brazil is a lot worse. But there were also cultural programs. And there was an application that we ended up selecting that would promote education of African Americans and prepare materials that relate to people who were important in African American history. And so that was something that we funded through the application process that came with the reform. But I think, Zachary, my question is more like, if we're thinking about the process of earmarking itself, your question to me about evidence of community support, you're getting at something about the process being ethical, aren't you? Like, if we're saying that we're taking that into account, we should take it into account, correct? Or you don't think that because your answer to me was, yeah, I don't know where you go in this debate.
Oh, okay. Well, a couple of things. One, in these interviewing former members of Congress and talking about the earmarking process, one of the concerns that a lot of them had was no one ever tracked these earmarks after they got spent on. The money was out the door. God bless everybody. But it wasn't but there wasn't any looking back to see, you know, how was it spent? Was it spent appropriately? Was this a waste of money? Was there any, you know, corruption, fraud, or
so there's no government agency responsible to make these accounts?
There wasn't.
Okay.
In the pre-reform era. And one of, I think, of the positive reforms moving forward, as the GAO now will selectively track the outcomes for these earmarks. And what that does is it creates more accountability for the earmarks. It basically raises the standard for a member basically asking for something. They have to be pretty sure that this is for a good cause, because if there's an audit later on and it finds that this was a waste of money or was misused or was a poorly conceived idea, that's going to be out there in the public. So that's one protection, is sort of seeing like, what is this money actually getting spent on? So that's important. The other thing I would say in terms of ethics is, you know, I think ethics is at an extreme. I think having no financial interest is a bigger part of sort of the ethical question, but getting back to, you know, trying to determine, you know, what is ethical and what is not ethical in the sense of politics. I think that that's a very tricky enterprise. And I think it, to a certain degree, it has to be left up to voters to decide, what the smell test, did you give a construction contract to somebody that has some influence in the district that somehow gave you back some kind of pecuniary or political benefit? That's out there for the public to know, because we know who's getting what and what it's spending on and how much. And members have to be accountable for that spending. So more transparency, I think, helps to solve that. But I think in government reform, we can push too far towards the perfect, and the perfect is the enemy of the good, I think, in this case. Where you remove all discretion, where you fully make things a process of grant making and definitions, you really lose a lot of the use of the process in the same way. Like I love to say the most secure system is one that no one can use.
It's interesting because in the case of Brazil, and there is a special audit court at the state level responsible for auditing and the accounts of municipalities. So if the municipality receive federal money, so it's accountable by the court, but the capacity of those auditing courts of, in fact, oversighting this process, it depends on political competition. So states that are more competitive, that have more power alternation, in which the political elite has not the capacity to appoint all members of the account office. So there is no one has the median voter of the accounting, the board of the accounting office. Those accounting office tends to be more active and tends to be more, and they have to be more attentive to this process. But in other states in which the same political elite is in power for quite a while, those audit institutions tends to be very docile. And as a consequence, we do not have accountability whatsoever. Right?
Yeah, and I don't want to put too much into saying the GAO is going to solve our problems, because as far as, at least last time I was in DC in June, they hadn't even started the process.
And I think they get a sample.
And they get a sample.
They get a sample of the community project fundings to audit.
And as
yeah,
of,
they can do it all.
and as of June, I don't know if
Right,
it's
it's a
changed.
random sample, right?
We don't,
But there are
don't
some
remember
smoking
anything
gun.
saying about what type of sample it would be, but I'm assuming that they are going to use good sense and there would be a random sample.
And at least as of June, this may have changed during this year's
Yeah.
appropriations
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
There wasn't an appropriation for future audits.
Yeah.
So there was one process that was funded, but we don't know what's coming after. We may by now. I have to look into that, but it's early days.
So I do want to open for questions from the audience. I know that Stephen has a question.
Sorry.
Well, so one thing I'm curious about, you said, Zach, that the reforms took away corporate yeah, and I'm just, the one thing that hasn't been discussed but out of your presentation is just the role of lobbyists, because this perception that pork helps the rich get richer, so much of that is because certain companies can pay to get an audience with them to plant the idea for a pork barrel project. And I'm just, is there any early evidence to indicate that reform is changing the nature of lobbying? And surely the spending on two big corporate areas, military, and energy dropped in your, according to your data, but it just yeah, like what is it doing to the role of lobbying, and what did you see in lobbying during the moratorium period?
I think lobbying was a problem before the moratorium, in the sense that it really did become a kind of pay for play kind of situation where the better represented you were on the Hill, the easier it was to obtain an earmark.
Right.
And Abramoff being sort of the worst.
Exactly.
During the moratorium period, I think things just changed. Lobbyists were still working on behalf of their clients through congresspeople, but who were then trying to work through the administration. So maybe there was one step removed there, but I don't think that substantively that changed. It may have become a little harder, but it certainly became less transparent in a way too. Like that process was more transparent from 2008 to 2010 than it was during the moratorium. Post-moratorium, the fact that for-profit entities cannot benefit I think has been a positive change. I think it's changed the allocation between spending bills in terms of where energies are focused. But, I think probably the interest is you could testify. One of the challenges is how well known are the opportunities for applying for these kinds of benefits within districts and states? And will it become a kind of like inside the beltway, like the people who are best connected and know this process best, being advantaged over, some smaller group in a district who may have a good project, but really don't know how to navigate this process? And I think that's up to, the appropriations committees and individual members to try to ensure that that divide doesn't happen, that it's the best informed that are getting these benefits, rather than there's some notion of a well broadcast opportunity that that tries to bring in as many meaningful projects as they can. And I don't have a good gauge of that right now. I think it was a bit of a scramble in 2021 to figure that out. But I also would say too, I've talked to a few members, or I should say, I talked to a few staff members about this process and how it went. They put a tremendous amount of effort into this. And I think they actually did a tremendous job in a short amount of time, not knowing about a process that had been absent for 10 years. And so I think 2021 was actually a pretty good debut. But yeah, it's a great question moving forward. Will being informed and having a good lobbyist matter? Because, even though it's not profit, you could be a municipality, a county, a state, a public employees union, all sorts of public facing kinds of entities. They have lobbyists too.
I think also in the experience that I've had on the Hill, it varies a lot across offices. I think some offices have a problem of communication and just talking to their districts. The DC office is not that much in contact with the district office and those things that are DC related, because this is mostly DC related because it happens in DC, right? But I want to say that in the experience that I had, there were no big lobbyists from the district. Those were all small organizations and small hospitals. And yeah, I think we could have done a better job with advertising, absolutely. But as he said, I basically was scrambling at the very last minute because we didn't have a chief of staff for a month. My legislative director was chief of staff for a month and I was doing work by myself. So I think everybody's learning with this process as it unfolds, right? Do we have any questions from the audience? Can I ask one more? Okay, cool. So I know that the contexts are very different in Brazil and the US, and we were talking about having the huge corruption scandal in Brazil right now in the Jair Bolsonaro administration with the secret budget. But I was curious, and I want to ask you both, and Carlos, when I ask this, like from what you heard from his presentation, what lessons can the US teach Brazil about how to reform these tools? Like, how can we make them more transparent and more legal? Yeah, and Zach too.
It's interesting because the two reforms that took place in the US and Brazil, maybe for different reasons, for different motivations, were initiated by the left, right? So here you mentioned that was during the Obama's administration, and in Brazil was during the Dilma Rousseff's administration. And both of reforms were really bad, generated and unbalanced and a lack of predictability of legislators' behavior, because they knew how to behave in order to have access to those monies and to extract electoral return out of them. But after the reform, it generated lots of uncertainty among them and lack of transparency and venues for corruption. So sometimes when we have an immoral motivation like the US, as you mentioned, or a lack of political support in the case of Brazil under the Dilma Rousseff's administration, she was in the night eve of being impeached, and she thought that by transferring the power to legislators, she would survive. Perhaps it was too late, and legislators realized that they would be better off without her than with her, despite the fact that they would have the power to to allocate the money without the necessity of supporting and the executive. But the reform at the end of the day was really, really bad, because as soon as legislators internalized it, that they no longer needed to vote according to the executive's preferences in order to have access to the money, the executive had to find another currency. And this process ended up inflating the cost of governing, because in addition to have the previous earmark, the individual and collective amendments, the government had to find another currency, and which was exactly what Beatriz mentioned, this reporter and reportoire and amendments. The budget reporter is in charge of amend himself or herself and the budget bill. And the executive realized that that was the possibility of allocating resources and extra resources to legislators in order to get support in Congress. So this, in addition to inflate, generate all kind of distortion regarding corruption. You know, they bought cars and all this and kind of thing, and it's really hard to follow, and because there is a fingerprint, as I mentioned to you earlier. So in order to make it transparent at the end, first of all, the new administration has just to end up appropriating the secret budget, because the secret budget is not mandatory in Brazil. It's authoritative. So it's just authorize the executive to spend. The executive, if he has enough power, has just to stop spending and try to regain the power that once gave back to legislators, and try to convince legislators that having the executive as the coordinator of this game would help them, rather than and having this decentralized idea, because by having a decentralized allocation of resources without a coordinator, it generates a cycling problem, because the majorities that eventually the executive is able to gather, to build, is not stable. It's one majority different to the next, depending on the issue or the bill that the Congress is debating for. So the previous game was by far much better, because the executive used to show its agenda, its political agenda. My platform is this one. Those that vote more frequently to this platform will receive more money. Those that are more unfaithful to this platform will receive less money. And those that receive more money get reelected. And the opposition accept that game with the expectation of becoming the government tomorrow. So that I believe would be by far and provide a superior equilibrium than the reform that made those amendments and imposed it and took away from the executive the discretion of strategically allocating that money.
Yeah, I mean, I feel uncomfortable making policy recommendations in a Brazilian context, but I will say, thinking about Carlos's comments in the American context, because we have a two-party system, because we have separation of powers between the executive and Congress, weirdly, one of the benefits of earmarking is actually separating interests away from partisanship. Like, we don't have a problem connecting individual members of Congress to their party. If anything, we have a problem with too much of that, where members start to become performative and they just simply talk about ideological, precepts as being the thing that they're fighting for in Washington, and not talking a thing about services or transactional politics. Like, these are the things we need in our district, and I can help bring them to you. The equation has really shifted in Congress recently to, I think, a kind of pathology towards a concentration on ideological motivations and a kind of purity of devotion to a precept of ideology. I think, so in earmarks, it's not like it's not so much. And this was a surprise to me when I started talking to members of Congress and trying to understand how the earmarking process worked before the moratorium. One of the assumptions that I had was that this was a tool that the majority used basically to try to make sure that their majority stayed together. And that simply wasn't the case. That happened marginally, like on occasion. Really, the purpose of it was distributional. There was a recognition on both sides that this is part of the job of being a member of Congress, to distribute resources where you think they are needed. And there was a process for doing so that really wasn't very partisan. Again, Republicans and Democrats spent on different things, but they both spent. And it created much more, I think it created a budget process that worked better. I haven't done the studies for this, and they haven't been done as far as I know, but it would be interesting to see concretely, you think about budget showdowns that we've had in America repeatedly, and the fact that, we haven't had a budget certain years, that it just was held over from next. Like the budget process has been a basket case since 2011, and some would say even a little before. I'd like to think at least that earmarking today, it's early days, I can't tell. I want to see, once we've had a few cycles of this, hopefully it lasts beyond this cycle if the majorities change. Mm-hmm. But if we have a few cycles of this, can we actually see a connection between tamping down ideology and building coalitions around the appropriations process, thanks to earmarking? And because of the limits that the House has placed, it's not going to be like, one person got $100 million and 100 earmarks or something like that. I mean, it's possible that one earmark could cost that much, but it has to be taken into account with that 1% discretionary cap. So the distribution will be fairly equal. Will that be enough to bring the benefits of undermining a sort of polarization that's happening in the institution, at least within the appropriations process? I'd like to think so. That's my hypothesis, at least.
I think that what he suggested, it would work extremely well for the US, I believe. But in the case of Brazil, because the president does not enjoy majority, so it becomes a very important tool of building that majority. That's why it's so key for this.
I think there is a point in what he's saying that gets my attention. I agree with you. And
okay.
I don't agree with your solution on how to move forward. I think it's more complicated than that. But we've talked about that. But there is something to what Zachary is saying, is that earmarks or budgetary grants or whatever we want to call them, they are constituency service, right? Mm-hmm. And they should be partly seen as that, right? The individual and collective amendments are much more transparent in Brazil than this mess that we're in right now. And part of that was because they were also seen as constituency service. So I think maybe reforming them, part of it is just looking at them as that. And yes, in Brazil, they also have other roles, but they're first and foremost a way of legislators to connect with their districts. And so once that is clear, then how do we make them more transparent? And we have precedent in Brazil itself, right? If we want to see the individual grant, the amendments, we can see who sent what where, and we can use that data. It's the mess of our political system that created more and more corruption, right? As you described very well. So I think it's important what you're saying, that they're isolated from politics in a way, because they're seen as constituency service, as a connection between legislators and their voters. I mean, it's the beauty of what David Mayhew wrote. And on that note, citing David Mayhew, I think, I don't know if there are no more questions from the audience. I think we're ready to wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Carlos, Zach, and Beatrice, for bringing this discussion together. I think we all thought a lot, but we've all come to think a lot differently about the nature of work-hero politics in both countries and how it can be used to serve constituents and build political strength. So thank you so much for all of your insights, and thank you to everybody who tuned in virtually. We hope to see you at future SNF-Agora events. You can check our events page at snfagora.ghu.edu,
and this will be recorded.
Yes, a recording will be made available soon, and we will post that as well. So check back for more details on that. Thank you so much.
Thanks.